Three infant boys were born in a rural area of southeast Ohio in the winter of 1856 under circumstances so unusual that doctors still discuss their case in whispers today. These triplets were born on one of the riskiest nights in the history of the Underground Railroad, in the secret basement of a Quaker meeting house, and they grew up with skills that went against every known rule of human physiology and psychology. Their family had been keeping secrets about what those boys were capable of for more than a century. If they were made public, they would make us reevaluate our assumptions about the boundaries of human vision. What I'm going to tell you has never been discussed in any academic community, recorded in any official medical publication, or told outside of family documents. Tonight, the truth is revealed after the evidence has been purposefully hidden. I need to know a little bit about you before we delve further into this terrifying story that starts in the shadows of America's most covert rescue network. Only those who have the courage to tackle puzzles that go against our basic assumptions about what is possible should watch this channel. Click the subscribe button now if you're among the select few who can endure stories that conflate historical events with unexplainable phenomena. Tell me what state you're listening from in the comments section while you're at it. Since what you're about to hear took place in America, in neighborhoods that may be uncomfortably close to your own rather than in some far-off magical region, I'd like to know where my fellow mystery seekers are congregating tonight. The tale I'm going to tell you started on a sour February evening when 3 lives entered the world in the most improbable location, starting a chain of events that would baffle medical professionals and scientists for years to come. In 1856, the Ohio town of Cedar Mills hardly merited the moniker. It had about 300 residents and was little more than a collection of small houses, a blacksmith shop, a rudimentary store, and the basic brick meeting house for the Quaker community. The Society of Friends at Cedar Mills, in contrast to their more outspoken Christian neighbors, quietly lived their faith. Their modest attire and serious manner demonstrated a strong dedication to simplicity and, above all, to the radical idea that all people were created equal in God's eyes. Their meeting house had been changed from a place of worship to something much more hazardous as a result of this conviction. On the Underground Railroad, it was now Station 14, an important destination for fugitives traveling north from Virginia and Kentucky. This covert operation had been carried out for almost 8 years by Elder Samuel Whitmore, a man whose penetrating gray eyes held secrets that could hang half the congregation, and whose aged hands told of decades cultivating the earth. A trapdoor beneath the speaker's platform led to a neatly hidden cellar beneath the meeting house's simple hardwood floorboards. After months of meticulous labor, the basement was excavated by hand and was a marvel of desperate engineering. It extended almost the entire length of the structure above, with the ceiling held up by heavy wooden beams and ventilation provided by a clever system of hollow fence posts that looked ornamental but actually provided fresh air to people hiding below. As they awaited safe passage to the next station, 3 to 15 freedom seekers may take refuge there in any given week, some for just one night and others for weeks. 1856's February had been especially perilous. Slave catchers were now able to roam freely throughout Ohio, with legal power to recover human property, according to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. For weeks, the region had been visited by professional bounty hunters, such as the infamous Garrett brothers, who offered high compensation for information regarding the activities of the Underground Railroad. You could practically taste the anxiety in Cedar Mills. Every unexpected guest, tap on the door after dark, and odd noise could be an indication of being found and imprisoned. 3 days prior, a young woman had arrived at the meeting house amid this atmosphere of fear and secrecy. She had only identified herself as Ruth, stated that she was 19 years old, and was clearly pregnant. After glancing at her big belly, Samuel Whitmore realized right away that she would not be going any farther north for a while. He hadn't anticipated how quickly that child would arrive, or how drastically it would alter their entire understanding of human nature. During her first nights in the cellar, Ruth whispered to them that she had come from a plantation in northern Kentucky. Even the stoic Quakers were astonished by her dignity and the fine diction of someone who had been taught to read, which was remarkable for someone in her situation. However, there was something else about her that unnerved others for reasons they couldn't quite pinpoint. She appeared to know a few things, but they were unsettlingly accurate. Long before there was a sound, she would be able to tell when someone was coming toward the meeting place. She would turn down meals that looked perfectly fresh, but turned out to be ruined later. Most disturbing of all, she occasionally looked straight at the person speaking and subtly contradicted what they were saying, not in a confrontational manner, but with the cool assurance of someone who just knew better. On her second night there, she had told Samuel's wife Martha, "That man who brought the supplies yesterday, he told you his name was Williams, didn't he, and that he was from Lancaster?" Martha had nodded, perplexed. Martha had written this off as the paranoid rambling of a scared pregnant woman, until 2 days later, when the man's true identity was revealed. "His name isn't Williams," Ruth had added, her voice barely above a whisper, "and he's never been to Lancaster in his life. I don't know why he lied to you, but he did." He had been posing suspicious inquiries regarding the activities of the meeting house, and was, in fact, using a fictitious name. Like many nights at Cedar Mills, the first night of the 23rd of February 1856 started off cold, dark, and surprisingly silent. A gentle knock on the door of the meeting house interrupted Samuel Whitmore's evening prayers. The signal was the same as before: 3 fast raps, a pause, and then 2 more. But as soon as Samuel raised the hefty wooden beam blocking the entryway, something felt off. A man named Joshua, whom Samuel had previously assisted, was the freedom seeker who staggered inside. However, his normally composed manner had been replaced by a barely contained fear. Joshua exclaimed, "They're coming," as his breath turned into white clouds in the icy air. He paused and glanced toward the basement entrance. "The Garrett brothers, and at least 6 others. They've got dogs, and they know about this place." Someone talked. When Samuel said, "There may be 2 hours behind me, probably less," his blood froze. They had worked for the Underground Railroad for 8 years, but they had never seen a direct threat like this. Because of the community's reputation for integrity and their meticulous operational security, the meeting house has always been seen as safe. However, someone had betrayed the Garretts if they were arriving with dogs and sophisticated knowledge of the basement. Evacuation was the urgent issue. Ruth, who had been suffering from sporadic labor pains for the majority of the day, was one of 7 persons currently taking refuge in the basement. Though she had been keeping an eye on her health, Martha Whitmore had hoped the birth would not occur for at least another week. But Mother Nature seemed to have other ideas. From under the floorboards came a faint moan, as though Joshua's words had called it. Martha's expression turned pallid. "Samuel," she muttered, "Ruth's time has come, right now." The hours that followed played out like a nightmare wrought with horror and ice. Martha and her daughter, Rebecca, went down into the basement to tend to Ruth's work, while Samuel and 2 other men labored feverishly to evacuate the other 6 freedom seekers through the meeting house's secret northern tunnel, a hand-dug passage that emerged almost a quarter-mile away in a thick grove of oak trees. All of their preconceived notions about birthing were called into question by what they discovered in that small, poorly lighted room. Although Ruth was in active labor, there was a serious problem. None of the typical symptoms of pain or distress associated with difficult births were present in her. Rather, she lay motionless on the hard straw mattress, breathing steadily and deliberately, eyes closed. She didn't scream or even tense her muscles when contractions arrived. Instead, she waited as though she were hearing something that only she could hear. Martha pressed her ear to Ruth's bulging abdomen in the manner of traditional midwives and inquired, "How many babies?" For the first time in an hour, Ruth's eyes opened. They were nearly glowing in the streaming candlelight. "3," was all she said. Martha looked at her daughter anxiously and said, "3 boys. They've been waiting for tonight." Triplets were uncommon enough in the best of situations, but having them born in a secret cellar as slave catchers came chasing with bloodhounds was an experience she had never had before. Ruth's bizarre remark about the babies waiting and her confidence about their gender were more concerning. What reason could unborn children have to wait? Martha's bewilderment was broken by the distant sound of horses. The events that followed were documented in Martha Whitmore's private journal, which was kept secret in her family for more than a century until it was uncovered in 2003 while renovating an old farmhouse. Samuel's voice called down from above, "They're here! The tunnel's clear, but we can't risk moving Ruth now." When the slave hunters came at the meeting house, Ruth's labor sped significantly, but in a way that was beyond medical comprehension, according to her story, which was written just days after the events. Ruth's barely perceptible breathing was the only sound made during the first baby's birth. No sobbing, no noise at all. The kid was perfectly formed when Martha caught him, and she was shocked to see that his eyes were open and awake and that he was already breathing correctly. The second baby arrived before she could even cut the umbilical cord. It was silent, breathing, and conscious from birth. Less than a minute later, the third completed what Martha called the most unnatural natural birth I have ever witnessed. The most peculiar aspect was still to come. Directly above the three babies, Martha could hear voices and footsteps as she cleaned and wrapped them. The Garrett brothers were searching the meeting house thoroughly after entering. Just feet above the newborns' heads, heavy boots strode across the hardwood floors. Once there was a person standing right on the trap door that hid the entrance to the basement. The three babies didn't make any noise at all throughout this whole period, even though there were strange guys and tracking dogs nearby. They didn't cry, whine, or make the little noises that all newborns do. With their matching dark eyes darting back and forth as though they were tracking the movements of the searchers above, they lay motionless in their mother's arms. They seemed to realize that complete stillness was essential to their survival. Ruth remained silent throughout the hunt. She just hugged her three sons and murmured to them in a language that sounded like no dialect Martha had ever heard, according to her notebook. Martha would later say that the words seemed to flow like water, soft and continuous, like a river running over stones. The search took over 3 hours. The Garretts were meticulous, systematic, and getting more and more irritated. They examined every closet, every room, and every potential hiding spot. They cursed their informant for giving them false information and eventually left after their dogs sniffed around the foundation of the meeting house and even scraped at the floorboards in a few spots. But they were never able to locate the basement entry. The three newborns didn't make their first noises until the horse sounds had totally vanished into the distance. When they did, the three of them let out a single eerie cry that appeared to reverberate off the basement's walls at the same time. Despite Martha's extensive expertise with difficult births, Ruth passed away less than an hour later from uncontrollable hemorrhage. They'll know things. They'll always know. Take care of them, but remember, they're not like other children, she said in her final words, which were so soft that Martha had to stoop to hear them. Ruth's passing left the Quaker community of Cedar Mills in a precarious position. 3 newborn boys who had no family, no legal existence, and no known father slave children born free in Ohio without any papers proving their status. Samuel Whitmore made the choice that would influence the rest of his life. The boys would be raised by the community as a whole, with each family sharing responsibility for their upbringing, but taking turns caring for them. In keeping with Quaker custom, the community gave the boys the names Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. It was evident from the beginning that Ruth's last comments had been more than just a dying woman's rants. The 3 boys were different from other kids, but in subtle enough ways that anyone who wasn't paying careful attention would have thought it was a coincidence. After taking charge of the boys' care during their first year, Martha Whitmore started taking thorough notes on their conduct. These notes, which were found with her birth book, offer a troubling look at the boys' early displays of their extraordinary talents. The triplets had a behavior that made their caregivers uneasy by the time they were 6 months old. At precisely the same time, they would all turn their heads in the same direction, frequently focused on windows or doorways that were vacant of people. It was usually someone who was angry, agitated, or hiding something when they finally showed up in such places, sometimes minutes later. Long before any adult could notice it, the boys appeared to perceive mental suffering. The triplets' ability to spot lies with perfect accuracy had become a pattern by the time they became 1 year old. The boys would react appropriately to honest remarks made by community members, but they would walk away and avoid conversing with anyone who was dishonest, even on insignificant topics. The adults initially thought this was funny, even useful. The boys would be able to tell right away if someone claimed to have finished a task they had truly forgotten. The triplets would get upset and refuse to approach a visitor to the meeting house who provided a phony name or inaccurate background information. However, it was more than just a lie detector. As the boys got older, they appeared to be able to recognize deceit in all of its manifestations, including unsaid goals, hidden motives, and hidden emotions, in addition to outright lying. The boys' responses to particular forms of deception were more troubling. Samuel Whitmore wrote in his private correspondence, "It is as if the boys can see directly into the human heart and know what lies therein." This would be a blessing, perhaps, if it did not seem to cause them such distress. They are constantly aware of the small falsehoods and hidden thoughts that all people carry. And this knowledge appears to be a burden rather than a gift. They were especially distressed around people who were concealing facts about violence or missing people. A wandering trader named Thompson made an appearance at the meeting house during their second year, stating that he was on his way to Columbus for business. Until he went, the triplets were unable to eat or sleep because they were so upset around him. After 2 weeks, word came that Thompson had been taken into custody for the murder of his business partner, whose body had been hidden in his wagon while he was at Cedar Mills. By the time they were 3 years old, the boys had acquired what the neighborhood came to refer to as the knowing look, a common expression they would use while concentrating on someone who was concealing something important. At the same time, all three would turn their heads, their black eyes seemingly penetrating whoever had caught their glance. Their tendency to mutter to one another during these episodes, always in that weird flowing language Ruth had employed when they were born, was the most unnerving aspect. The local doctor who had been keeping an eye on the boys' growth, Dr. William Harrison, was both intrigued and troubled by their potential. In a letter to a co-worker at the Medical College of Ohio, he stated, "I have examined these children repeatedly and can find no physical abnormality that would account for their unusual perceptive abilities. Their hearing, vision, and other senses appear normal, though perhaps slightly more acute than average. Yet, they consistently demonstrate knowledge of matters that should be beyond their perception. I am forced to conclude that either these children possess some form of sensory capacity unknown to medical science, or I am the victim of an elaborate deception, though how 3-year-old children could maintain such a deception is beyond my understanding." The lads had an immediate and significant impact on the Underground Railroad's operations. Through the network of stations and conductors, word of their skills stealthily got around. With the boys' flawless precision in identifying betrayers and infiltrators, freedom seekers started asking explicitly to be routed through Cedar Mills. The triplets' presence in the basement of the meeting house turned into a safety assurance. The freedom searchers understood they were among friends if they stayed composed and peaceful. There was always a clue that someone in the group wasn't trustworthy if the boys were upset or wouldn't go into the basement. The lads were unquestionably accurate, but Samuel Whitmore was in the awkward situation of having to rely on 3 young children to secure one of Ohio's most significant Underground Railroad sites. They prevented potentially disastrous revelations about the network's activities by identifying 7 possible infiltrators over the course of 3 years. But as they grew older, the cost of their skills became more noticeable. The lads' intense looks and whispered conversations caused the other kids to become more and more aloof. The community's adults were appreciative of the boys' protection, but they couldn't get rid of the sense that they were being watched and assessed all the time. Given that every thought and feeling was somehow apparent to the triplets, even the most truthful people felt uneasy in their presence. The boys' developing self-awareness and their impact on others were the most concerning aspects. By the time they were 4 years old, they knew how to behave differently around strangers, keeping their knowing glances under wraps and their private consultations in whispers. However, it appeared that this self-consciousness made them even more isolated, erecting a wall between them and the outside world that got stronger every year. Changes in Cedar Mills in 1860 would put the triplets' skills to the test in ways no one could have predicted. Tensions had escalated in Ohio following Abraham Lincoln's election, and the Underground Railroad was getting more and more deadly. Bounty hunters such as the Garrett brothers were operating with near impunity, and federal marshals were conducting raids more often. The 4-year-old boys started exhibiting a new and more unsettling side of their skills during this time of increased peril. They appeared to be able to sense the emotional discomfort of persons who were miles away, in addition to identifying dishonesty and suppressed feelings in those who were physically there. The triplets were safely inside the warm meeting house, with their regular caregivers, when they suddenly got quite anxious on a bitter January morning. This was the first reported case. At the same time, all three boys started to cry, not the typical sobs of distressed kids, but a keening scream that seemed to convey extreme fear and despair. Nothing worked, despite Martha Whitmore's best efforts to soothe them. After wailing in agony for over 6 hours, the boys eventually stopped as the sun started to set. 2 days later, a freedom seeker brought heartbreaking news to the meeting house. Some 40 miles south of Cedar Mills, a group of 11 individuals, including 3 children, had been taken prisoner by slave catchers. The triplets' crying had started almost exactly at the same moment as the capture. Even worse, one of the women in the seized group was pregnant and had given birth during the attack. She and her kid had perished from exposure on the grueling trek back to Kentucky. Despite being startled by this experience, Samuel Whitmore wrote it off as a coincidence until 3 weeks later. Even though the boys' discomfort only lasted 2 hours this time, it was much more severe. The next day, just as the triplets had started exhibiting indications of severe distress, they received word that an Underground Railroad conductor had been shot and died while assisting a family in escaping near Portsmouth, Ohio. Following the third such episode, the boys were examined by Dr. Harrison, who had been recording their development. His results were quite disturbing and were documented in his private notes. During episodes of apparent long-distance distress sensing, the boys' pulse rates become synchronized, their breathing patterns identical, and their body temperatures drop by several degrees. Most remarkably, their brain activity appears to increase dramatically. They are clearly experiencing intense mental stimulation, despite appearing outwardly distressed. I can only conclude that their nervous systems are somehow detecting emotional trauma occurring at great distances, though the mechanism by which this occurs is completely unknown to medical science. The boys' long-distance sense was particularly tuned into circumstances involving deceit, betrayal, and they always sensed when someone was being chased, betrayed, or murdered, but they never responded to common mishaps or natural deaths. The majority of southern and central Ohio, as well as perhaps northern Kentucky, seemed to be within their range. Outside of the Underground Railroad network, word of the triplets' skills spread. In the hopes that the boys would somehow detect whether their missing family members were still alive and where they might be discovered, families with missing loved ones started traveling to Cedar Mills on pilgrimages. The boys themselves appeared to be drawn to these needy families, but Samuel Whitmore was hesitant to take use of the children's talents in this way. The Brennan family, whose one 6-year-old daughter, Mary, vanished while visiting relatives in Columbus, was the most notable example. After hearing stories of 3 kids who could locate lost individuals, the girl's parents traveled to Cedar Mills after she had been missing for 3 months. Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac went over to the upset parents without being asked, despite Samuel's earlier refusal to include the boys. In front of Mrs. Brennan, the triplets formed a line and started their trademark coordinated whispering. After a few minutes, Isaac moved forward and gestured toward the Ohio River, which was to the southeast. "She's there," was all he said. Following this information, local authorities searched a remote farm near Chillicothe and discovered Mary Brennan locked in a cellar, along with 2 other young women who had been abducted by a man posing as a traveling preacher. "She's scared, but she's alive. The man who took her isn't who he said he was." After being taken into custody, the kidnapper admitted to having plans to sell the women into prostitution in New Orleans. The community's perception of the triplets changed once Mary Brennan was rescued. They were changing from being kids with a peculiar knack for spotting lies to something quite else, something that even their Quaker guardians found extremely unsettling. With every month that went by, the boys' skills became more powerful and focused, and their accuracy and range appeared to have no boundaries. The lads' growing emotional distance from the outside world, however, was possibly the most unsettling aspect. It was wearing on them to always be conscious of violence, deceit, and human suffering. The majority of their time was spent hunched together, muttering in their own language, and they seldom ever played or smiled. Their interactions with adults were characterized by a melancholy and knowledge that seemed unattainable for such young children. In his last words to the boys prior to his passing in 1862, wrote, "I fear that we are witnessing the emergence of human beings who are fundamentally different from the rest of our species. Their abilities appear to be expanding rather than stabilizing, and I cannot predict what they might become capable of as they mature. More troubling is the psychological cost of their gifts. These children are bearing witness to more human suffering and evil than most adults encounter in a lifetime, and they are doing so without the emotional defenses that adults develop over time. I do not know what kind of men they will become, but I fear they will be men apart from all others, forever isolated by their terrible knowledge of what lies hidden in the human heart." Ohio's Underground Railroad activities saw unparalleled instability when the Civil War broke out in 1861, but it also gave the Triplets additional chances to show off the full scope of their remarkable talents. The lads began to react to military operations that defied all rational explanation when Union and Confederate forces started to move through the border areas. When 6-year-old Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac started exhibiting symptoms of severe agitation in the summer of 1861, Samuel Whitmore became aware of this new development for the first time. The lads would stand at the windows of the meeting house for days on end, staring south toward the Ohio River, their faces etched with horror expressions that were much too old for their age. When Samuel inquired about their concerns, Isaac, who was always the most outspoken of the three, only replied, "Too many people are going to die." So many people. 3 days later, news broke that Union forces had lost badly at the First Battle of Bull Run. When comparable instances started to happen more frequently, it became impossible to write off the timing as a coincidence. The boys' emotional responses were exactly in line with the number of casualties engaged, and they appeared to sense significant military battles days or even weeks before Cedar Mills learned about them. Their apparent ability to identify certain people amid the thousands of soldiers passing through the area was even more unsettling. A young Union soldier named Thomas Caldwell made a stop at the meeting house in September 1861 while returning home on leave to see his family in Marietta. With expressions of deep anguish on their faces, the Triplets started their coordinated muttering as soon as they saw him. The boys' primary caretaker, Martha Whitmore, who is now in her 62nd, asked them what they felt about the soldier. "He won't make it home. The man who's supposed to be his friend will shoot him for his money 3 days from now near the river crossing." Ezra stepped forward and said, in a voice that sounded too old for his small frame. Thomas Caldwell laughed when told of the prediction, claiming that he was traveling alone and had no money worth stealing. However, his body was discovered 3 days later, 20 miles east of Cedar Mills, close to a river crossing. A deserter from his own unit called Patterson had shot and robbed him after posing as Caldwell's comrade and agreeing to accompany him on a portion of the journey. The local community was rocked by the prediction's accuracy, but it was just the beginning. The youngsters started making more detailed and unsettling predictions about persons they met over the course of the ensuing months. They were frequently able to pinpoint the exact day and time of death. They were able to accurately foresee violent crimes, betrayals, and desertions. Worst of all, they appeared to be aware of which of the freedom fighters going through the meeting house would make it to Canada and which would be apprehended or killed en route. The moral ramifications of the lad's understanding were difficult for Samuel Whitmore to comprehend. Should he alert others to the threats the Triplets anticipated? Should he make an effort to stop the disasters they foresaw, or was it too risky to act on this knowledge? The lads' seeming disregard for the misery they saw further added to the devastating weight of their choices. With the same cool detachedness they could use to weather commentary, they recounted deaths and betrayals. The pivotal moment occurred in the spring of 1862, when a dozen freedom seekers, led by conductor James Morrison, with whom Samuel had collaborated for years, showed up at the meeting place. Over the course of 10 years, Morrison had successfully led hundreds of people to freedom, making him a reliable ally. However, the Triplets reacted violently and instantly upon seeing him. As soon as Morrison stepped into the meeting house, the three boys started screaming, a sound they had never made before. It was something primordial and dreadful. like the warning cries of creatures detecting death rather than the wailing of upset kids. Their faces twisted in utter fear as they screamed and gestured at Morrison. The response confused and upset Morrison. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced from the guys, who had usually been composed around him on past trips. When Samuel attempted to ask the triplets about their senses, all they could say was, "Death. He brings death. So much death." Samuel was hesitant to reject a dependable conductor and 12 frantic freedom seekers, in spite of the boys' cautions. Morrison maintained that he was ready to lead the group on to the next station, and that he had transported them safely from Kentucky. The 12 freedom seekers, who were men, women, and children between the ages of 8 and 60, appeared to be truly needy and devoid of dishonesty. But the more hours went by, the more agitated the triplets became. Tomorrow night, in the woods by Miller's Creek, he'll call to them and they'll trust him because they think he's their friend, but the men with guns will be waiting. Samuel was faced with an impossible decision. Either rely on the word of 3 young children whose abilities he didn't understand, or risk the lives of 12 people based on what might be nothing more than childhood intuition. They refused to enter the basement while Morrison and his group were present, and they persisted in their unsettling predictions. He ultimately made a decision that would follow him around for the rest of his life. Although he gave Morrison and the group permission to continue their voyage, he warned them to exercise caution by sending word ahead to the next stop. Additionally, he made arrangements for 2 local men to follow from a distance, supposedly for added security. In the most horrifying way imaginable, what they saw the next evening would confirm the triplets' warnings. As the boys had guessed, Morrison led them to a clearing close to Miller's Creek. He called out in the darkness there. Rather than leading them to the next safe stop, armed slave catchers appeared from the bushes in a matter of minutes. It was too late for the freedom seekers to flee after realizing they had been deceived. 2 children were among the 7 persons who were killed outright in the ensuing pandemonium. The other 5 were apprehended and brought in chains back to Kentucky. Although they were too far away to stop the massacre, the 2 men Samuel had dispatched to guard the area were close enough to watch Morrison take a sizable payment from the slave catcher's leader. For months, James Morrison, the dependable conductor who had led hundreds to freedom, had been a double agent, directing groups into meticulously planned ambushes and selling intelligence about Underground Railroad activities. The whole town was devastated when Cedar Mills learned of the massacre. One of their most trusted allies had been exposed as a traitor. 7 people had died, and 5 others had been sentenced to slavery. The fact that 3 7-year-old youngsters had understood exactly what would happen and their warnings had been disregarded was perhaps the most upsetting reality. Samuel had never witnessed such a response from the triplets to the news. For the first time in years, they displayed real feeling instead of their customary cool-headedness. Not grief or hatred, but a profound dissatisfaction that appeared to cover not only the current catastrophe, but also something much more significant about the essence of human wickedness. Isaac replied softly, "People never listen," referring to the 3 of them. The boy's words hung in the air like a judgmental declaration, and Samuel realized that something fundamental had changed. They never want to believe what we can see. They think we're just children, but we've seen more death than anyone in this room. We know what people are capable of when they think no one is watching. The triplets had evolved into something more than just kids with special talents. They were now able to see into the deepest recesses of human nature with perfect clarity, and that awful insight was making them into creatures that were more and more alien to the rest of humanity. Events will soon demonstrate that the boys' powers were still developing and becoming stronger, just when Samuel believed he had seen the entire scope of their potential. What they may become, and whether the community that had reared them would be able to withstand the reality of who they truly were the questions now, rather than what they could sense. In the harsh winter of 1863, when the boys were 8 years old and the Civil War had entered its most violent stage, the triplets made the discovery that would forever alter the way the world viewed them. Under the sponsorship of the Medical College of Ohio, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a neurological expert and one of the state's first female doctors, had been researching the boys for 6 months. Dr. Harrison's pre-death reports had piqued Dr. Hartwell's attention, and she had persuaded Samuel Whitmore to permit a thorough medical examination of the triplets. Every presumption she had about human consciousness and perception would be called into question by what she found throughout that investigation. Dr. Hartwell tested the lads using the most up-to-date medical equipment available in 1863, revealing the true nature of their skills. The triplets had cerebral features never seen in human people, according to her findings, which were recorded in a thorough study that was promptly classified by military authorities and kept out of the public eye for more than 60 years. More astonishingly, the boys' neurological systems seemed to be in continuous connection with one another. Despite abnormally high activity in areas of their brains linked to pattern recognition and emotional processing, despite being in different rooms, the other two boys' bodies responded instantly when Dr. Hartwell delivered moderate electrical stimulation to one of their arms. During severe concentration, their brain waves, breathing patterns, and heart rates coordinated, resulting in what she called a single consciousness distributed across 3 separate bodies. The most shocking revelation, however, was made when Dr. Hartwell started conducting meticulously regulated tests to test the boys' capacity to recognize deceit. To gauge the boys' physiological reactions to each kind of encounter, she set up volunteers to make both truthful and misleading comments while they watched. What she discovered was incomprehensible to human senses. The triplets were reacting to quantifiable shifts in electromagnetic fields produced by human cerebral activity, not just using voice cues, body language, or facial expressions to identify lying. The boys' brains produced electrical patterns that were different from those of regular humans, according to Dr. Hartwell's crude instruments. These patterns appeared to resonate with the electromagnetic signatures of other people's emotional states. As Dr. Hartwell put it in her classified report, these children appear to possess a form of biological electromagnetic sensitivity that allows them to directly perceive the electrical activity of other human brains. When someone lies, experiences fear, or harbors violent intentions, their neural activity creates specific electromagnetic signatures that the boys can detect with the same accuracy that we might observe colors or hear sounds. This explained not only their ability to detect deception, but also their ability to sense emotional distress at great distances and their uncanny accuracy in predicting violent events. They were human individuals with sensory powers that had advanced well beyond what is often expected of humans. They were neither prophets nor supernatural entities. However, Dr. Hartwell's findings brought up even more unsettling issues. What had produced such a tremendous evolutionary jump if the boys' powers were due to genetic mutation? Analyzing tissue samples from their late mother Ruth, whose body had been kept in the Meeting House Cemetery in accordance with Quaker custom, provided the solution. Ruth's bones were examined by a doctor who found that she had been exposed to high levels of a number of industrial chemicals throughout her pregnancy. These chemicals were frequently employed on southern plantations to produce indigo dye. These substances, which included lead-based colors and mercury compounds, had seriously damaged Ruth's nervous system. But they also seemed to have caused her unborn children to undergo hitherto unheard-of genetic alterations. The boys embodied a completely novel aspect of human evolution, a mutation that would have otherwise resulted in death, but instead produced improved sensory capacities. They served as living evidence that human perception and consciousness may develop in ways that science had never thought possible. The most terrifying revelation was perhaps Dr. Hartwell's last one. She came to the conclusion that the boys' improved abilities were not unique to their generation based on her examination of their genetic makeup. Their descendants and their children's children would inherit the dominant features caused by the genetic alterations that had given rise to their electromagnetic sensitivity. "We are witnessing the birth of a new branch of human evolution," she wrote in her private memos. "These boys will father children with similar abilities, and those children will be even more sensitive to human electromagnetic fields. Within 3 or 4 generations, their descendants may possess sensory capabilities that will make current human perception seem primitive by comparison. The consequences will be staggering." The triplets, if Dr. Hartwell was right, represented the emergence of a new subspecies of humans, not only medical oddities. Furthermore, their offspring may eventually be able to understand human thoughts as readily as they can read facial expressions if their skills continue to improve with each generation. What to do with this knowledge, however, was the most pressing issue. Both Union and Confederate troops would be eager to use the lad's skills for military information as the Civil War raged. If the triplets' skills were known outside of the little Quaker community, they would be considered precious resources that could be taken, examined, and turned into weapons. Samuel Whitmore had to make a difficult choice. Dr. Hartwell was ready to publish her research, which would guarantee the boys' protection through public scrutiny while simultaneously drawing attention to them on a global scale. The boys' anonymity might be preserved by suppressing the research, but doing so would expose them to people who were already aware of their potential. When federal marshals arrived in Cedar Mills on a chilly February morning with orders to take the triplets to Washington for consultation on national security issues, the decision was made for them. After hearing about Dr. Hartwell's studies, someone in the military leadership felt that the boys' skills would be useful in identifying Confederate spies and questioning Confederate prisoners. Long before they arrived at the meeting house, however, the triplets had detected the marshal's approach. The boys were already packed and prepared to depart that morning when Samuel discovered them, their meager belongings crammed into tiny canvas sacks. Simply, "We have to go," Caleb said. Isaac gave a solemn nod. "If we stay, bad things will happen to everyone here. We've seen it. The men who are coming don't just want to use us. They want to study us, cut us open, see how we work. And when they're done with us, they'll come for our children and our children's children." Ezra, who is always the most reserved of the three. "We've seen the future. They want to create a world where people like us are kept in cages and used as tools. We won't let that happen." The boys' choice was final. Before the federal marshals could reach them, they would slip into the maze of caverns and secret passageways that crisscrossed the hills surrounding Cedar Mills. In a final hopeless effort to persuade them to stay, Samuel claimed that government protection would be safer than hiding in the woods. The boys' maturity beyond their 8-year-old years was demonstrated by Caleb's response. "Mr. Whitmore, we can sense the intentions of every person within 50 miles of this place. We know that the government men aren't coming to protect us. They're coming to own us. We've felt their thoughts, and we know what they plan to do. We'd rather take our chances in the wild than become prisoners in a laboratory." The triplets were getting ready to leave the only home they had ever known, as the sound of approaching horses reverberated across the freezing fields. However, one last discovery they made before leaving would follow Samuel Whitmore for the rest of his life. Silently, "There are others," Isaac said. "Not many, but some. Other children born during times of great violence and suffering. Children whose mothers were exposed to the same kinds of poisons that changed us. They're scattered across the country, and most of them don't even know what they are yet. But we can sense them, and they can sense us." Ezra came forward, a young man with a collar that appeared ancient. "Someday, when it's safe, we'll find them. We'll teach them what we've learned, help them understand their abilities, and maybe, if we're careful, we can build something better than what exists now. A world where people can't lie to each other, can't hide their evil intentions, can't pretend to be something they're not." As they were about to disappear into the abyss were a promise as well as, "We'll be watching, we'll always be watching, and we'll remember who helped us and who tried to hurt us. That knowledge will be passed down to our children and their children and their children after that. The world is about to change in ways that people can't imagine, and it's going to start with us." 3 hours after the triplets had vanished, the federal marshals arrived at the meeting house to discover vacant rooms and the vanishing remnants of 3 remarkable children who had disappeared as completely as if they had never been there. The lads were never located, even after military forces and tracking dogs conducted extensive searches. They had just vanished into the rural landscape of Ohio, leaving only recollections and unanswerable questions. Military officials promptly classified Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell's findings, which was kept under wraps for more than 60 years. The medical community was astonished when her papers were eventually published in 1924, but by that time the boys would have been close to 70 years old, and there was no longer any chance of studying them. For the remainder of his life, Samuel Whitmore lived with the mystery of what he had seen until 1889. In his personal papers, which were unearthed following his passing, "I have seen the future of humanity, and it both terrifies and amazes me." Those three boys represented something new under the sun, something that could either elevate our species to unprecedented heights or destroy us completely. I pray that wherever they went, whatever they became, they remembered the love and kindness they received in our small community. After the triplets left, the Underground Railroad station at Cedar Mills was never the same, even though it remained open until the conclusion of the Civil War. The mission grew more risky without their capacity to identify betrayers and infiltrators, and a number of conductors were either murdered or captured. After the meeting house itself was finally abandoned in 1878, the structure gradually deteriorated. However, the triplets' disappearance wasn't the end of their tale. A child in California who could tell when someone was lying simply by looking at them. Twin boys in Texas who could find missing people with unfathomable accuracy. And a girl in Pennsylvania who could foresee accidents days before they happened were among the reports of unusual perceptive abilities that surfaced throughout the United States over the ensuing decades. For those who knew what to look for, a pattern emerged, although the majority of these tales were written off as folklore or exaggeration. Their mothers had frequently been exposed to industrial chemicals or other toxic substances during pregnancy. The children themselves showed the same electromagnetic sensitivity that Dr. Hartwell had recorded in the Cedar Mills triplets, and the children were always born during periods of extreme violence or social upheaval. Dr. Hartwell's 1,863 suspicion that severe environmental stress and exposure to specific harmful substances could cause quick genetic alterations that are passed on to future generations has been validated by modern genetic research. Scientists now acknowledge that stress-induced human evolution is more prevalent than previously thought, and the triplets were among the first known examples of this phenomena. There are at least 47 known cases of people with increased electromagnetic sensitivity who were born between 1,850 and 1,900, mostly in areas impacted by industrial pollution or war. According to recent investigations, the genetic legacy of these people has persisted throughout the American population, despite the fact that the majority of them led quiet lives and never developed their skills to the degree displayed by the Cedar Mills triplets. Up to 0.1% of today's Americans may be descended from these early cases, according to Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University, who has spent 20 years researching electromagnetic sensitivity in humans. We're looking at the emergence of a human variant that possesses sensory capabilities our species has never had before, she said in an interview in 2019. These people aren't telepaths or psychics. They're humans with enhanced neural sensitivity that allows them to detect electromagnetic patterns generated by other human brains. The ramifications for human civilization, law enforcement, and national security are significant. If Dr. Chen is right, thousands of Americans might be able to perceive hidden emotions, spot missing people, or identify fraud to some extent. The majority might not even be conscious of their skills, writing off their precise intuitions as chance or lucky guesses. However, the research's implications for the future of human evolution may be its most fascinating feature. What other abilities might surface as our society encounters new problems if environmental stress can cause quick genetic changes that improve human perception? What would today's descendants be able to accomplish if the Cedar Mills triplets were right when they predicted that their skills would get stronger with each generation? That question might have a closer answer than anyone thinks. While renovating an old farmhouse in southeast Ohio in 2003, builders uncovered a secret room that had records that had been meticulously preserved for more than a century. These included a 1,923 letter, signed with a single name, but written in 3 different handwritings. The Children of Cedar Mills. The letter was addressed to future generations who will understand, and it included comprehensive genealogical records identifying the descendants of the three boys who had disappeared in 1863. These documents showed that the triplets had, in fact, lived long lives, survived their absence, and fathered many children who shared their special talents. Even more astoundingly, the letter included accurate forecasts of future events that have since happened, including the year of the moon landing, the precise dates of both world wars, the site of the atomic bomb's test, and dozens of other historical occurrences that wouldn't happen for decades after the letter was written. We are still here. We are still watching. We have grown in number and in ability with each passing generation, just as we promised we would. The time is coming when humanity will need the gifts we carry, and when that time arrives, we will be ready. Until then, we remain hidden, learning, growing, and preparing for the day when the world will finally be ready to accept what we represent, the next step in human evolution. The letter ended with a modern address in Ohio and the straightforward instruction, "When you are ready to know more, come to this place on the anniversary of our birth. We will be waiting." The 23rd of February 2024 was the 168th anniversary of the triplets' birth. Local sources state that around 50 persons gathered at the designated address that day, including researchers, descendants of participants in the Underground Railroad, and those who said they had skills similar to those displayed by the original Cedar Mills triplets. We don't know what happened during that meeting. There are no official records of the incident, and those who were there have declined to talk about what they saw. However, a number of the participants have started collaborating on initiatives pertaining to criminal investigations, psychological research, and missing persons cases in the months after the meeting. Dr. Chen, who attended the February conference, will only state that the Cedar Mills triplets' impact is far from over. In fact, it might be just getting started. Over a century and a half later, the tale of three boys born in a cellar during one of the darkest eras in American history is still being told. It remains to be seen whether they are the most hazardous mutation of humanity or its greatest promise for evolution. The descendants of Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, however, are undoubtedly still observing, studying, and getting ready for whatever happens next somewhere out there. And if the future predicting skills of their predecessors continue to hold true, the next phase of human evolution might be upon us sooner than anyone thinks. This conundrum demonstrates that extraordinary situations can occasionally result in remarkable people, and that the limits of human perception may be significantly more malleable than we previously thought. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think that under such harsh circumstances, human evolution could make such significant strides? Have you ever had occasions where your intuition appeared so precise that it felt impossible? Please share your thoughts regarding the triplets and whether you believe that their descendants are still living in the comments section below. If you like this story and would want to see more mysteries that defy our preconceived notions about human potential, please subscribe, click the notification bell, and tell someone you know who enjoys stories that blur the boundaries between science and the impossible. We'll look at another sinister truth from America's past in the upcoming video. See you then.